He walked into that restaurant expecting nothing. What he found changed everything. And what happened next? Nobody at that table saw coming. At 32, Nathan Cole had buried his idea of love so deep he'd stopped looking for it. Then his friends dragged him to a blind dinner, and across the room walked a woman every other guest couldn't stop whispering about. For all the wrong reasons. Victoria Sterling, billionaire, CEO, and in that moment, the most alone-looking person in the room. What Nathan did next silenced the table. What Victoria admitted afterward broke her open completely. And what began as a dinner nobody wanted became the story neither of them could have written. If this story finds you tonight, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The reservation was for 7:30, and Nathan Cole showed up at 7:28 because being late felt rude, even when he had no interest in being there at all. He stood outside Arden, one of those restaurants where the menu had no prices and the lighting was specifically designed to make everyone look like they were either falling in love or about to close a deal. And he tugged at the collar of his button-down shirt and wished, not for the first time that evening, that he had just said no. He almost had. 3 times. The first time, Marcus had called him on a Tuesday and said, "There's this woman, she's incredible. Just come to dinner, it's casual, no pressure," and Nathan had said he'd think about it. The second time, Diane, Marcus's wife, who had known Nathan since college and therefore had no boundaries whatsoever, had texted him a paragraph that included the phrase, "You're not getting any younger," and a winking emoji, and Nathan had replied, "I'll see," which everyone in his life had learned by now meant probably not. The third time, Diane had called while he was putting his daughter to bed, and she'd said, "Sophie already said you could go. I asked her." And Nathan had looked across the room at his 7-year-old, who was propped up against her pillows with her stuffed rabbit, and a guilty expression that confirmed she had in fact been consulted and had in fact betrayed him, and he'd said, "Fine. One dinner." One dinner. That was the deal he'd made with himself standing on the sidewalk outside Arden, watching the valet take a man's car keys. One dinner, he'd be polite, he'd be decent, and then he'd go home, and Diane would have her story about how she tried, and that would be the end of it. He went inside. The hostess led him to a private dining room in the back. Not just a table, a whole room, which meant Marcus had spent real money on this, which meant Diane had decided this was serious, which meant Nathan was already slightly trapped. The room held a rectangular table set for 8. 6 of the seats were already occupied. Marcus stood when he saw Nathan and crossed the room with the enthusiasm of a man who had clearly been warned by his wife not to make it weird and was absolutely making it weird. "You came," Marcus said, grabbing his hand and clapping him on the shoulder. "I said I would." "I know, but—" "Marcus." "Right, yeah, come meet everyone. Eat popcorn." There were 3 other couples at the table besides Marcus and Diane, James and Claire, who Nathan vaguely knew from some work event 2 years ago. A man named Philip, who kept touching his watch in a way that suggested it cost more than Nathan's car, and Philip's girlfriend, whose name Nathan immediately forgot because she was talking about a trip to Santorini and he had stopped listening. The seat beside Nathan was empty. "She's just running a few minutes behind," Diane said, appearing at his elbow with a glass of sparkling water and the careful expression of a woman who had invested significant emotional labor in this evening. "Her name is Victoria. She's brilliant, Nathan. She really is. And she's funny. She doesn't take herself too seriously, even though she probably could." "Diane, I'm just saying." "I know. Thank you." She gave him a look that said she knew he wasn't sure about any of this, and then she squeezed his arm and went back to her seat, and Nathan sat down and picked up the menu and tried to look like a person who was comfortable. The truth was, he wasn't uncomfortable at dinner parties. He wasn't even uncomfortable with the idea of meeting someone new. What he was uncomfortable with, what he had been quietly uncomfortable with for the better part of 3 years, was the particular combination of hope and disappointment that came with being set up, being evaluated, performing some version of himself that was good enough for a stranger's expectations. He had done it twice before, both times at Diane's urging, and both times it had ended after 2 or 3 dates with a mutual acknowledgement that it wasn't working, which was fine, genuinely fine, but also each time left him sitting in his car in the parking lot of his apartment complex, thinking about the specific shape of the life he'd ended up with. and wondering how it had gotten so small. He was 32 years old. He had a daughter he loved more than anything on earth. He had a job he was good at, civil engineering, mostly infrastructure contracts, not glamorous but steady and honest. He had a two-bedroom apartment that Sophie had colonized almost entirely with drawings and stuffed animals, and a collection of small rocks she kept for reasons she had explained to him but that he had never fully understood. He had friends who cared about him. He had a life. It was a good life. He knew it was a good life. He just sometimes sat in parking lots and thought about how quiet it was. He was on his second glass of water and deep into the breadbasket when he heard the door to the private room open behind him, and he heard the subtle but unmistakable shift in the room's atmosphere. The small recalibration of attention that happens when someone enters a space and the people already there are not quite sure how to arrange their faces. He turned. Victoria Sterling walked in like a woman who had learned, a long time ago, that the only way to enter a room full of people who were already making up their minds about her was to walk in like she owned the building. She was 30 years old, Nathan would learn later. She stood about 5'5" in heels that were sensible rather than performative. She wore a navy dress that was elegant and well-fitted and clearly expensive in the way that expensive things sometimes are when they're chosen by someone who actually has taste rather than just money. Her hair was dark, pulled back at the sides, loose at the ends. She carried a small clutch in one hand and her phone in the other, and she was texting something as she came through the door, finishing the message before she looked up. And when she looked up, her expression was composed and polished and completely, carefully neutral. She was a large woman. That was the plain fact of it. Not a secret, not a tragedy, just a fact. Victoria Sterling was a large woman, and in the 3 seconds between when she appeared in the doorway and when the hostess guided her toward the table, Nathan watched the room do the thing that rooms do. The fractional adjustment, the exchanged glance between Philip and his girlfriend, the very small and very deliberate way that Claire straightened in her seat like she was bracing for something. The way Marcus, his friend, his genuinely good friend, looked briefly at his wife with an expression that wasn't cruel but wasn't nothing either. Nathan looked at Victoria Sterling and saw none of those things. What he saw was a woman who was walking across a restaurant dining room with her shoulders back and her chin level and her face arranged in an expression of absolute control, and underneath that, in the set of her jaw, in the way her thumb pressed against the edge of her phone case, in the millisecond of stillness before she reached the table and put on her smile. What he saw was a woman who was tired. Not tired like she needed sleep. Tired like this was something she'd done 100 times before and would do 100 times again, and she'd gotten very, very good at making it look effortless. "Victoria," Diane said warmly, rising from her seat, "I'm so glad you made it." "Of course." Her voice was low and clear and unhurried. She kissed Diane on the cheek. "The traffic on Meridian was terrible. I should have taken the bridge route." "You're not late at all. Come sit down. This is Nathan." And she looked at him. Nathan stood up because his mother had raised him to stand when someone approached the table, a habit so deeply drilled it happened before he thought about it. And he said, "Hi, Nathan Cole." There was something in her eyes when he stood, something quick and reflexive, almost imperceptible, like she'd expected something different and had to quietly revise. Then it was gone, and she was extending her hand and her grip was firm and direct. "Victoria Sterling, sorry I kept everyone waiting." "You didn't," he said. 7:31. That's basically on time. She looked at him for a second. A real look, not a polite one. "I appreciate a man who tracks the clock. Occupational habit. I do infrastructure timelines." "What does that mean?" "Bridges, mostly. Road systems. I figure out how long things take, and then I tell people, and then they don't listen, and then I was right." Something moved across her face, quick, startled, almost against her will, not quite a smile, the architecture of one. "That sounds frustrating," she said, sitting down. "It is," he said, sitting down too. "But I've gotten used to being right quietly." This time she did smile. It was small, and it happened fast, and she reached for her water glass immediately afterward, like she needed something to do with her hands, but it was real. Nathan noticed it the way you notice a light turning on in a window you assumed was empty. The evening began. "Down, Dinner at Arden unfolded the way dinners at that kind of restaurant always did. Slowly, course by course, with pauses between that were meant to feel luxurious but sometimes just felt long. The conversation around the table was the usual collage of the kind of people who dined in private rooms, real estate, travel, a few brushstrokes of politics that everyone immediately retreated from. A sustained and largely pointless debate about whether a restaurant in the city's financial district was worth the wait. Nathan ate his food and listened and responded when spoken to and tried not to look at his phone to check the time, because looking at your phone at dinner was something he'd specifically told Sophie not to do, and he believed in the principle even when it was inconvenient. Beside him, Victoria was doing what he suspected she'd learned to do at exactly these kinds of tables, present and engaged and contributing precisely enough to be considered excellent company without offering anything that could be used against her. She knew things. That was obvious from the first 20 minutes. When the conversation touched on supply chain logistics, she had specific and accurate things to say. When James mentioned a development project in the city's East Corridor, she knew the zoning history. When Philip made an offhand remark about a tech acquisition he'd been following, she interrupted him, gently but clearly, to correct a figure he'd cited, and then immediately softened it with, "I might have the updated number. That deal's been moving fast," in a way that let him save face without letting the wrong information stand. She was sharp, sharp. The way people who have had to work harder than everyone else to be taken seriously get sharp. Not showy, not performative, just precise. Like a knife that's been honed past the point of ceremony. Nathan found himself paying attention to her in a way he hadn't expected. "So," said Philip, somewhere between the second and third courses, in the tone of a man who has decided to be interesting. "Victoria, I have to ask, Sterling Capital, that's the hedge fund that restructured the Coburn portfolio last year, right?" "Sterling Asset Management," she said, correcting the category without edge. "But yes, that was a significant move. You took on a lot of criticism for that." "I did. Was it worth it?" She considered him for a moment. "The portfolio returned 14% in the following quarter, so mathematically, yes. Whether it was worth the criticism is a different calculation." "You don't seem like someone who loses sleep over criticism," Philip said, and there was something in his voice, not quite admiration, not quite condescension, somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. And Claire laughed lightly, and the Santorini girlfriend nodded as if she understood the dynamics at play, which Nathan doubted. "I sleep fine," Victoria said evenly. "I've had a lot of practice." There was a pause. Philip smiled the smile of a man who had been deflected and was deciding whether to try again. He tried again. "I imagine in your position, you deal with a lot of people making assumptions about you." "Everyone deals with that," she said. "Sure, but..." He gestured vaguely, meaninglessly. "You know..." The table had gotten slightly quieter in the way that tables get when someone is about to say something that can't be unsaid, and everyone can feel it coming. "I don't, actually," Victoria said, still even. "Why don't you say what you mean?" A beat. "I just mean," Philip said, "that in a room full of, the typical finance crowd, you'd stand out. For multiple reasons." Another vague gesture that did not gesture at anything specific and gestured at everything specific simultaneously. "That must come with some interesting dynamics." The table held its breath. Nathan set down his fork. He had been watching this exchange from the time Philip opened his mouth, and he had recognized what it was immediately. The particular social cruelty of the almost said, the implication that presents itself as curiosity, the test disguised as conversation. He'd seen it before. Not often, but enough. He looked at Philip. "I think the finance crowd probably stands out for all kinds of reasons," Nathan said. His voice was conversational, not confrontational. Calm, the way a closed door is calm. "Victoria is obviously the most qualified person at this table to talk about that world, which is probably why you're asking her." Philip blinked. "I know." Nathan picked up his fork again. "It was a compliment, I'm sure." He said the last sentence without looking at Philip, directing his attention back to his plate, and the meaning landed clean and quiet and left nowhere to go. Diane, across the table, had gone very still. Marcus was looking at his wine glass. Claire had turned slightly toward James. Victoria was looking at Nathan. He didn't look back right away. He finished the bite he'd taken, and then he looked at her, and her expression was something he couldn't entirely read. Not gratitude exactly, not surprise exactly, something that sat between those two things and was more honest than either. "So you did infrastructure work on the Kellerman Bridge project?" she asked, and her voice was normal, steady, redirecting the table with the confidence of a woman who had steered harder conversations than this one. "Consultation on the foundation spec," he said. "Took 3 years longer than it should have because the city kept changing the load requirements." "I heard about that. The secondary span issues? You know the Kellerman project? Sterling Asset holds some of the municipal bonds associated with that corridor development. I know more about load-bearing specs than I ever anticipated needing to. That's either impressive or depressing. In my experience," she said, "it's usually both." And the table breathed again, and the courses came, and the evening continued, and Nathan thought about the look on her face in that moment after he'd cut Philip off. That brief, unguarded moment that she'd tucked away so quickly he almost missed it. And he thought quietly to himself, there's a real person in there who is very used to being invisible. The meal had moved into its third hour, and the table had split into the smaller conversations that happen when the main group architecture collapses. Marcus and James debating something about golf handicaps, Claire and Diane talking about a school district issue, Philip on his phone with the practiced discreetness of someone who isn't being very discreet. The Santorini girlfriend had excused herself to the restroom 20 minutes ago and returned looking refreshed in a way that suggested a meaningful relationship with the powder room mirror. Nathan and Victoria had been talking for the better part of an hour. It happened without either of them particularly deciding to do it. One thread of conversation had led to another, and somewhere along the way they had turned slightly toward each other, and the rest of the table had receded. She had told him, without meaning to tell him all of it, but telling him all of it anyway, about how she'd started Sterling Asset Management at 24 with a seed fund from a family trust, and 2 analysts she'd had to convince to believe in her before she'd proven she'd earned the belief. About how the first year she'd slept 4 hours a night and eaten at her desk and made 17 decisions a week that could have destroyed the company, and how she'd made 16 of them correctly and 1 of them badly, and how that one bad decision had cost her a client relationship she genuinely missed, not for the money, but for the person. About how being the youngest CEO in the room was different from being the youngest CEO in the room when you looked like her, and how she'd learned to walk into spaces pre-armored, which was useful, but also exhausting in the way that being constantly armored is exhausting. She said that last part and then stopped, like she'd surprised herself with it. "Sorry," she said. "That was a lot." "No," he said. "It wasn't. I don't usually—" She paused. "I'm usually better edited than this. Maybe the editing gets tiring too." She looked at him. Really looked at him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to look at him for most of the evening. "Yes," she said quietly. "It does." He nodded. "My ex-wife used to say I was a good listener. She also said it was annoying because she preferred arguments to understanding, which I always thought was an interesting combination of complaints." Victoria laughed. It was a real laugh, unperformed, surprised out of her. A quick exhale that she covered with her hand, and then she lowered her hand because covering it was the edited version, and she'd just told him the editing was exhausting. "What happened?" she asked. "With the marriage?" "If you want to talk about it." He considered. "We were 25, and I think we were in love in the way that you can be in love at 25, which is real but also kind of incomplete. We were both different people than we thought we were. Sophie came along and—" He stopped. "She's not a sad part of the story. Sophie's the best thing in my life. But my ex, Emma, she had different ideas about what she wanted, and I think she'd had them for a while before she told me, and by the time she told me Sophie was 2, and that was—" He picked up his glass. "It was a hard year." "Where is she now, Emma?" "Phoenix. She's remarried. She's doing well. We co-parent okay. Sophie goes to her for summers and some holidays. It's functional. Emma's a good mother. She just wasn't. We just weren't." He shrugged. "Some things don't work." "Do you miss being married?" It was a direct question, the kind that presumed they were past the small talk layer, which they were. He thought about it honestly instead of answering reflexively. I miss having a person, he said. Not in the way that sounds lonely, though it does sound lonely. I mean, I miss having someone to tell the small things to. The stuff that isn't big enough to call Marcus about, but that accumulates. Sophie said something hilarious yesterday, and I told it to a colleague at work because there was no one else to tell it to, and she laughed politely, the way you laugh at someone else's kid's story, and I thought, yeah, I miss having someone who would actually think that was funny. Victoria was quiet for a moment. What did Sophie say? She asked. She told me that her stuffed rabbit, his name is Gerald, told her that he wanted to be a lawyer when he grew up because he's good at arguing. And then she said, completely serious, I'm thinking of helping him study. A beat. Victoria smiled, not the small controlled one from earlier. A real one, wide enough to show the slight unevenness of her front teeth, the kind of smile that had clearly decided not to care how it looked. That's genuinely funny, she said. Thank you. Gerald appreciates the support. She laughed again, and this time she didn't cover it. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the table had wound down to dessert and scattered conversation, and Diane was doing the things she did at the end of evenings she considered successful, which was a particular kind of quiet, glowing satisfaction that she tried to make look casual and failed at completely. Nathan had noticed, at some point in the last hour, that Philip had made 2 more comments in the general direction of Victoria that sat in that same uncomfortable register as his earlier one. Nothing you could directly call out, just the texture of a certain kind of social condescension, small and consistent as dripping water. A remark about how surprising it was that she'd gotten into asset management given her age. A comment about how she must be used to people underestimating her. Each one dressed in the language of observation, each one landing somewhere slightly below the belt. Victoria had fielded all of them with the precision of a woman who had been fielding them for years. Nathan had said nothing the second time, and nothing the third time, because they were smaller and faster, and he wasn't sure until the third one that he wasn't imagining a pattern that didn't exist. He wasn't imagining it. It was the fourth one that settled it. They were talking about a charity gala that was coming up the following month, some benefit that several people at the table were apparently attending, and Diane mentioned that it was a formal event, and Claire said she already had her dress. And Philip looked at Victoria with an expression that was almost a smile and said, I assume formal wear is a bit of a production for everyone. A very short silence. It's not, actually, Victoria said. I have a tailor. Of course, I just meant, I know what you meant, she said, and her voice was still even, but her hand on the table had flattened slightly, a small and involuntary tell. Nathan looked at Philip. You know what I've noticed? Nathan said, and his voice was easy. Conversational, the tone of a man making an observation rather than starting a confrontation. You keep wrapping things in I just meant, and I was just saying, but the thing wrapped inside is always the same thing. The table was very quiet. I don't know what you're implying, Philip said. I'm not implying anything, Nathan said. I'm saying it directly. You've been working in a comment about Victoria's size since the salad course. Maybe you think you're being subtle, or maybe you just enjoy the plausible deniability, but either way, it's gotten old. He paused. And for what it's worth, I think you've missed what's actually interesting about the person sitting 3 feet from you, which is a waste for you, not for her. Dead silence. Nathan, Diane said softly, not alarmed, just careful. I'm fine, he said, still looking at Philip. Just observing. Philip stared at him for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he looked at his watch, the expensive one, and said something to his girlfriend about a car they'd called. They left 20 minutes later. The table breathed differently after that. James refilled everyone's wine. Diane found a reason to touch Nathan's hand briefly as she passed him the dessert menu, and he pretended not to notice because the attention embarrassed him slightly. Marcus told a story about a hiking trip that had nothing to do with anything, and everyone was grateful for it. Victoria didn't say anything to Nathan directly for a few minutes. She talked to Diane, she accepted dessert, she laughed at Marcus's story. Then, very quietly, while the others were occupied, she turned toward him and said, You didn't have to do that. I know, he said. I'm used to it. I know that too. She looked at him. There was something careful in her face, like she was deciding whether to trust what she was looking at. Why then? He thought about it for a second. Because being used to something doesn't mean you should have to be. She held his gaze for a long moment. He didn't look away. Okay, she said finally, quietly. Not thank you. Something more complicated than that. Just, okay? Like she was accepting the truth of something she'd been arguing against for a long time. But they left the restaurant at 10:30, tumbling out into the cool night air with the slightly dazed quality of people emerging from a long, enclosed space. The valet was bringing cars around. Diane hugged everyone twice. Marcus shook hands and clapped shoulders. The goodnight process at this level of dinner party was its own extended event. Nathan had his jacket over his arm and was waiting for his car when Victoria appeared beside him. I'm waiting for my driver, she said. Okay, he said. They stood in a companionable quiet for a moment, watching a cab pull up and let someone out on the far side of the street. I almost canceled, she said. He looked at her. Tonight? Twice. I had my assistant draft the message both times. A pause. I usually do cancel when Diane sets these up. She's set you up before? 3 times. I canceled the first 2. Her voice was even, matter of fact, but there was something underneath it that was less even. By the time you've attended enough of these evenings and had enough of the particular experience I tend to have at them, it becomes a fairly rational decision to just not. He was quiet, listening. I came tonight because she told me she had someone she genuinely wanted me to meet, not just someone she wanted to put in a room with me to see what happened. She paused. I'm not sure yet which category you are. That's fair, he said. You were good in there. Philip was easy. He always is. It's the easy ones that wear you down, not the hard ones. She looked out at the street. The hard ones you can fight. The easy ones just accumulate. Yeah, Nathan said. I think I understand that. A black car pulled up. The driver, a quiet man in a dark jacket, stepped out and opened the rear door without a word. Victoria picked up her clutch. She looked at Nathan. That real look again, the one she'd been rationing all night. I don't know if I should admit this, she said, because you'll either think I'm being dramatic, or you'll think I say it to everyone and I don't say it to everyone. He waited. Tonight was the first dinner in a long time, she said carefully, where I didn't spend the drive home thinking about the wrong things. He let that sit for a moment. What do you usually think about on the drive home? Whether I was too much or not enough. Whether I talked too loudly or held my fork wrong or took up too much space at the table in all the ways you can take up too much space. A small, tired exhale. It's boring, mostly, just loud. And tonight? She looked at him, and for the first time all evening, she wasn't performing composure or managing her expression or staying 2 steps ahead of the room. She just looked at him. Tonight I'm thinking about Gerald, she said, and whether he has a specialty in mind, like contracts or litigation. He smiled. She saw it. He strikes me as a civil litigator, Nathan said. Good at arguing, but fundamentally wants things to be fair. That's quite a psychological profile for a stuffed rabbit. He's a complex guy. She smiled again. The full one, the real one. Then she turned and got in the car, and the door closed, and the black car pulled smoothly away from the curb. Nathan stood on the sidewalk in the cool night air, his jacket over his arm, watching the taillights disappear around the corner. Behind him, Marcus appeared and handed him his car keys, which the valet had apparently already retrieved, and Marcus said nothing, just stood there beside him for a moment, the way old friends do. I liked her, Nathan said, mostly to himself. Yeah, Marcus said. I figured you might. Nathan pocketed the keys. He thought about the look on her face when he'd stood up at the table. That quick, reflexive recalibration, like she'd expected something and gotten something different instead. He thought about the way she'd said okay, not as gratitude, but as a kind of quiet, tired surrender to the possibility that someone might actually mean it. He thought about what it must be like to walk into every room already knowing what the room was probably going to do with you, and to walk in anyway, shoulders back, chin up, face arranged, for years. He unlocked his car. He got in. He sat there for a moment before starting the engine. Sophie would be asleep by now, The apartment would be quiet. There would be a note from the neighbor who watched her in the evenings, probably including some story about what Gerald had said at bedtime. He started the car. He drove home thinking about a woman who had almost canceled twice, and about the particular courage it takes to walk into a room that has already decided about you, and about the fact that it had been a very long time since he'd sat in a parking lot thinking about the shape of his life, and felt, for the first time in a while, like maybe it wasn't as small as he'd thought. He didn't call her the next day. Not because he didn't want to, but because he'd made a habit over the years of not doing things just because he wanted to, which was either discipline or self-sabotage, depending on who you asked. Marcus would say self-sabotage. Nathan preferred discipline. He went to work. He reviewed load calculations for a drainage project on the city's west side that had been sitting on his desk for a week. He ate lunch at his desk because the break room had been taken over by someone's birthday celebration, and he didn't know the birthday person well enough to eat their cake. He picked Sophie up from school at 3:15, listened to a detailed account of a disagreement she'd had with a classmate named Devin over the correct pronunciation of a word that turned out to be a word neither of them had actually used correctly, and made pasta for dinner. After Sophie was in bed and Gerald had been tucked in with the seriousness that the situation required, Nathan sat on the couch and looked at his phone and thought about what Victoria had said outside the restaurant. Tonight was the first dinner in a long time where I didn't spend the drive home thinking about the wrong things. He thought about the way she'd said it, carefully, like she'd measured each word before releasing it, like she'd decided to trust him with something small and real, and was watching to see what he did with it. He put his phone face down on the couch cushion. He picked it up again 20 minutes later and texted Diane. Did she get home okay? Diane's reply came back in under 40 seconds, which meant she'd been waiting. She texted me when she got in. She had a good time, Nathan, and then, because Diane was constitutionally incapable of restraint, she had a good time, followed by 3 separate emojis that expressed collectively a level of enthusiasm Nathan found slightly alarming. He typed back, "Good." Then, "I did too." Then he put the phone down and went to bed, and slept better than he had in a while. He got her number from Diane on Wednesday. He sent a text that evening that said, "This is Nathan from the dinner. Gerald wanted me to let you know he's leaning toward environmental law." He stared at it for a long time after he sent it, with the specific regret of a person who has attempted a joke over text and can no longer tell if it's funny. Her reply came 40 minutes later. "He'll need a strong undergraduate foundation. Does he have a plan for that?" Nathan exhaled. He typed, "Sophie's working on a curriculum. It's mostly picture books right now, but she feels the visual component is important. Smart pedagogy," Victoria wrote back. "Early literacy is underrated in legal education." "Do you want to get coffee sometime?" he typed, and then deleted it, and then typed it again, and sent it before he could delete it a second time. A pause. Longer than the others. He set the phone down and did the dishes, which took 4 minutes, and when he came back there was a message waiting. "I don't usually do this." He wrote, "Coffee?" Saying yes when I don't know how it's going to go. He thought about that for a moment. Then, "For what it's worth, I don't either. I'm pretty bad at this." "You didn't seem bad at it. I was nervous the whole time," he wrote. "I ate too much bread." Another pause. Then, "Saturday morning. There's a place called Clement's on Faro Street. They have outdoor seating and the coffee is actually good, which is rarer than it should be." "Saturday works," he wrote. 10 o'clock? 10, she confirmed. And then after a brief pause, "Don't be late. I tracked the clock too." He smiled at his phone in the empty kitchen. It was a stupid thing to do, smiling at a phone in an empty kitchen, but he did it anyway. But Clements on Faro Street was a narrow, slightly cramped coffee shop, wedged between a dry cleaner and a bookstore that specialized in maps, which Nathan thought was an admirably specific niche. The outdoor seating was 4 small metal tables on a strip of sidewalk, wide enough for them and not much else, sheltered by a dark green awning that needed replacing but hadn't been yet. Victoria was already there when he arrived at 9:58. She was at the far table with a coffee in front of her and her phone in her hand, reading something, and she was wearing a dark green jacket over a simple black top, and her hair was down, which it hadn't been at dinner, and she looked different, less assembled, less arranged. And Nathan noticed the difference, the way you notice when someone has stepped out of a frame and turned out to be larger than the picture suggested. She looked up when he was a few steps away. 2 minutes early, she said. I hustled, he admitted, pulling out the chair across from her. I hit traffic on Meridian. I take the bridge route. I know, you mentioned it. I should have listened. He sat down. How's your coffee? Good. Better than it looks. She glanced at the worn awning. Everything here is better than it looks. I appreciate a place that doesn't oversell itself. She smiled. Me too. The server came, a teenager with headphones around her neck who handed Nathan a laminated menu and looked at Victoria's cup and said, Another? And Victoria said yes without looking up from Nathan, and the girl disappeared back inside. They talked for 2.5 hours. It was the kind of conversation that doesn't feel like 2.5 hours because it keeps finding new angles. Not the performed variety of good conversation where both parties are secretly impressed with themselves, but the irregular doubling back, occasionally interrupted by a truck, going past kind that happens when two people are genuinely curious about each other and keep finding things they weren't expecting to find. Nathan told her about growing up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, about his father who fixed elevators for 30 years and had opinions about load-bearing mechanisms that had probably influenced Nathan's career choice in ways neither of them had ever discussed directly. Victoria told him about growing up in Connecticut, about a mother who had built sterling asset from a much smaller family investment and then handed it to Victoria at 23 with the words, "Don't wreck it," and about how those 3 words had sat on her chest every day for 7 years, like a stone she'd gotten used to carrying. Does she still say things like that? Nathan asked. My mother died 4 years ago, Victoria said. It was a flat sentence, not unfeeling, just stated, like a fact about the weather. Cardiac event. She was 58. I'm sorry. She was difficult, Victoria said, in a tone that contained a complicated relationship's worth of feeling compressed into 2 words. She was difficult and she was brilliant, and she didn't know how to tell people she was proud of them. She just expected them to know, and I don't know if she was proud of me before she died. A pause. I think she probably was, but I don't know. And Nathan didn't say I'm sure she was, because he didn't know that, and she was smart enough to recognize the meaninglessness of the consolation. He just said, That's a hard thing to not know. Yes, she said simply. It is. The teenage server came back with Victoria's second coffee. They both sat with that for a moment, the comfortable and slightly weighted quiet of 2 people who have said something true. Tell me about Sophie, Victoria said, and Nathan, who had learned over the years to read a room carefully enough to know when a subject change was a retreat and when it was a genuine invitation, understood that this was the latter. So he told her. He told her about Sophie at 2, who had refused to walk anywhere, and instead had demanded to be carried with such absolute imperial certainty that Nathan and Emma had briefly wondered if they'd accidentally raised a tiny monarch. About Sophie at 4, who had decided she wanted to be a meteorologist because rain was dramatic, her word, delivered with great feeling. About Sophie now at 7, who was in a phase of asking questions that Nathan frequently could not answer, and who seemed to regard this as a personal failing on his part. What kind of questions? Victoria asked. Last week she asked me why people are mean to each other if being mean doesn't actually feel good. A silence. What did you say? I said I didn't know, and she gave me a look like I'd missed an obvious one. He rubbed the back of his neck. She wasn't wrong. Victoria turned her coffee cup slightly in her hands. She sounds like a person I'd like to meet, she said, and then immediately added, I mean that as a compliment to her, not as I wasn't implying. I know, Nathan said. I don't want to presume that this is Victoria. He said her name gently, and she stopped. I know. She exhaled. I'm usually better at sentences. You're good at sentences, he said. You're just a little worried right now. She looked at him. Is it that obvious? Only because I am too, he said, but I think that's okay. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at her coffee and something in her shoulders dropped slightly, a small release of tension she'd been holding since before he arrived, probably. And when she looked up again, she seemed fractionally less like a person prepared for impact. Okay, she said, the same word she'd used outside the restaurant. He was beginning to understand it was a word she used when something landed somewhere real. Yeah, they met the following Saturday and the Saturday after that. It was never quite planned until it was a text midweek, low stakes, a time and a place, and then 2 hours at Clement's or once at a different place, a Mexican spot near Nathan's office that had no outdoor seating but excellent breakfast tacos and a jukebox that played without apparent logic or pattern. On the third Saturday, it rained, and they moved inside to the back corner of Clement's, which was cramped and smelled like wet jacket, and a family with a loud toddler was at the table next to them, and it should have been a worse conversation than the outdoor ones. But it wasn't. They had developed, by this point, the easy back and forth of people who have found each other's conversational rhythms. Who knows when to wait and who knows when to push? Whose jokes land with whom? Who gets quieter when they're uncomfortable versus who gets louder? Nathan had learned that Victoria got sharper when she was nervous, her sentences getting more precise like she was calibrating under pressure. Victoria had learned that Nathan had a tell when he was thinking hard about something. He'd go quiet and turn his coffee cup in slow quarter rotations, and if you interrupted him too fast, he'd lose the thought and it wouldn't come back. What they didn't talk about mostly was the structural reality of the gap between their lives. It wasn't that it didn't exist. It existed in obvious and persistent ways. Victoria Sterling ran an asset management firm with $17 billion under management and a staff of over 200 people across 3 offices. She had a penthouse apartment in the city's financial district, and a house in Connecticut she rarely used, and a car service she used instead of driving because she found driving in the city stressful, a fact she'd mentioned almost apologetically, like it was something to be embarrassed about. Nathan made a good salary by most reasonable measurements of good. He drove a 6-year-old Civic. He bought his shirts at the same 2 places he'd been buying shirts since he was 27. He had no penthouse. He had the apartment, and Sophie's rocks, and Gerald. None of this had been said directly. Not really. It sat between them like weather, present, occasionally noticed, never quite the thing either of them wanted to make the conversation about, until Diane decided it should be. It was a Thursday evening when Diane called and Nathan was making dinner, and he made the mistake of answering. "I talked to Victoria today," Diane said. Nathan stirred the pot. "Okay. She seems happy. I mean, she seems, Victoria, she doesn't seem happy exactly. She seems like she's stopped seeming unhappy, which for her is basically the same thing. Is there a reason you're telling me this? I'm telling you because she mentioned you in 4 separate parts of a conversation that was officially about an event she's helping sponsor. And when I pointed that out, she got very quiet and then changed the subject, which is how Victoria says she's scared." Nathan set down the spoon. "Diane." "I just want to make sure you're being careful with her," Diane said, and the lightness in her voice dropped away. Nathan, she's had a rough time. Not in the way that people say that. I mean genuinely rough. People have been awful to her in ways that she doesn't talk about because she's too proud to let it show. Men specifically. Men who dated her and thought it was fine or funny to make her feel small, and she let them because she kept thinking the problem was her. And I don't think you're that. I really don't. I wouldn't have done this if I thought that. But she's starting to trust you, and that's not nothing for her." Nathan stood in his kitchen with the pot simmering behind him and felt the particular weight of being genuinely seen by someone who was saying something true. "I'm not playing a game with her," he said. "I know. I like her. I don't mean that as a qualifier. I mean it." "I know that too," Diane said, quieter now. "I just needed to say it out loud to someone. Have you said any of this to her?" "She'd close down completely if I did. You know how she is." "Yeah," Nathan said. "I'm starting to." After he hung up, he stood at the stove for a while, not stirring, just thinking. He thought about the way Victoria walked into rooms, that prepared, pre-armored walk. And he thought about what Diane had said, men who made her feel small. And he felt something move through him that was not exactly anger, but was in the neighborhood of it. Something dull and quiet and persistent. He thought about the way she said, "okay," when something was real. He stirred the pot. He finished making dinner. He helped Sophie with her reading homework, which was going well, and with her math homework, which was not going well and never had been. a fact Nathan privately attributed to his own history with arithmetic as a child and kept meaning to address. He did not call Victoria that night. He sat down and thought about what he actually wanted and tried to be honest about it, the way he made himself be honest about things when the dishonest version was more comfortable. What he wanted, he decided, was to keep seeing her. Not because she was impressive, though she was, not because she was interesting, though she was that too, but because the specific experience of being around her, the particular texture of a conversation that went where it actually went rather than where it was supposed to go, the way she laughed when she forgot to manage the laugh, the way she looked at him like she was still deciding whether to trust what she was seeing. That specific experience was something he had not felt in a long time and had mostly stopped expecting to feel. He picked up his phone and sent her a text. Sophie wants to know if Gerald should take the LSAT or try to get into law school on a portfolio. She feels strongly about the alternative admissions movement. 3 minutes later, I'd need more information about his lived experience. Has he faced systemic barriers in his academic career? He's a stuffed rabbit in a 2-bedroom apartment, Nathan wrote. The systemic barriers are significant. Then the portfolio route is clearly more appropriate. I'll look into programs. You'd actually look into programs. A pause. Then, I find I'm enjoying this more than most things I do on Thursday evenings. He read that twice. Same, he wrote. The fourth Saturday, Nathan was 20 minutes late. It was not his fault in any meaningful way. There had been a situation at Sophie's school, a miscommunication about pickup timing between Nathan and the after-school program, and by the time it was sorted, he was already running behind and hit a construction detour that added another 12 minutes. He texted Victoria as soon as he knew he was delayed, which was the right thing to do, and she replied, "Okay. I'll order you a coffee," which was a small and unremarkable kindness and somehow mattered more than it should have. When he finally got to Clement's, slightly flustered, hair still damp from where he'd rushed out without fully drying it, she was at their usual table with 2 cups and her reading, and she looked up when she heard him coming, and her expression was not annoyed. She just looked at him. "Construction on 5th, he said, dropping into the chair. "I know. I took the bridge route." A small, dry beat. "You really need to learn the bridge route." "I know." He picked up the coffee. "Thank you for this." "It's a cup of coffee." "Still." She watched him for a moment with that measuring look that she still hadn't completely stopped using on him, the one that was becoming less defensive and more just, curious, like she was still working something out. "Is Sophie okay?" she asked. "Yeah, just a miscommunication. She wasn't upset, she just liked the drama of it." He shook his head slightly. She told the program coordinator she'd been abandoned, with exactly that emphasis, and then she went back to her worksheet. The coordinator was more distressed than Sophie was. Victoria laughed. "The real one, quick and unguarded. She's theatrical." "She really is. I don't know where she gets it. Emma's pretty understated. I'm definitely understated." "You're not as understated as you think," Victoria said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" She considered how to say it. "At the dinner, when you said what you said to Philip." She kept her voice even, not dramatic. "Most people who are actually understated don't do that. They think about doing it later in the car when it's too late. You just did it, like it was obvious." "It was obvious. That's what I mean." She turned her coffee cup. "It was only obvious to you." He sat with that for a moment. He wasn't sure what to do with it. It wasn't a compliment exactly. Or not only a compliment, it was more like a piece of observation being handed to him carefully, like she was testing its weight. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said. "That night, outside." "Which part?" "About spending the drive home thinking about whether you took up too much space." He kept his voice steady, not gentle in a way that might feel condescending, just direct. "I've been thinking about that. That you've been doing that, running that calculation, for years." She was quiet. "That's an exhausting thing to carry," he said. "I told you. I'm used to it." "Yeah, you said that." He looked at her. "I just wanted to say that you don't have to do it around me. That's all. I'm not making a declaration or anything. I just wanted to say it plainly because I'm not sure you hear it plainly very often." A long pause. "I don't," she said. "Okay then." She looked out at the street. A delivery truck went by and briefly blocked the thin November sunlight, and when it passed, the light came back and landed across the table between them. "My last relationship," she said, after a moment, "ended because he told his friends I was embarrassing to be seen with in public." She said it with the same flat precision she'd used when she'd told him her mother died. Just a fact, just a thing that happened. We'd been together for 8 months. I found out from someone who wasn't his friend and wasn't trying to be cruel, just genuinely didn't know I didn't know. She paused. I'd been telling myself I was imagining the way he acted when we were out together, that I was being paranoid. Turns out I had good instincts and I was just ignoring them. Nathan said nothing. He let it be said. "I don't tell people that," she continued, "not because it still hurts, though it probably still does somewhere, but because it's the kind of story that makes people feel sorry for you, and I have spent a very long time trying not to be someone people feel sorry for." "I don't feel sorry for you," Nathan said. "I feel—" He stopped, adjusted. "I think you've dealt with a consistent, low-grade garbage situation with more dignity than most people would manage. That's not pity, that's just accurate." She looked at him. The measuring look, but softer. "You're annoying," she said. "Yeah? Because I can't find the calculation with you." She said it like it frustrated her, and he thought it probably did. "I keep looking for the thing underneath, the thing that's actually happening, and I can't find it. And I'm usually very good at finding things." "Maybe there isn't a thing underneath," he said. "There's always a thing underneath." "Not always." She looked at him for a long, undefended moment. The kind of moment that doesn't happen between people who are still strangers, not quite. "I want to believe that," she said. "I know," he said. "You can take your time." Outside, a woman walked by walking 3 dogs, all different sizes, all pulling in different directions, and for a moment both Nathan and Victoria watched her trying to manage them, and failing in a manageable way. And they both almost said something about it, and the almost simultaneous almost saying was its own kind of wordless communication, and they both smiled at the same time, and neither of them mentioned it. Nathan finished his coffee. Victoria started a third one. A cloud moved past and the light shifted again, and somewhere inside Clements, the teenage server dropped something with a loud clatter and called out an apology to no one in particular. They stayed another hour. The conversation moved on to other things. A building project Nathan was consulting on, a board situation Victoria was navigating that she described obliquely because even in trust she was careful about what she said out loud. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things that accumulate into the furniture of a shared language. When they finally left, standing again on the sidewalk outside the green awning, Victoria's driver was already waiting half a block down, and Nathan had to get back for Sophie, and the goodbye was quick and unaccompanious. "Same time next week?" he asked. "Probably," she said, which he had learned by now was her yes. He walked to his car. He was halfway down the block when he heard her call his name, and he turned. She was standing in front of Clements with her hands in her jacket pockets and the November light coming down around her, and she looked at him from down the sidewalk. "The bridge route," she said. "You get on at Callaway Street and stay left. You'll save at least 15 minutes. He nodded. "Callaway. Got it." She held his gaze for a second. Then she turned and walked to her car, and the door closed, and she was gone. Nathan stood on the sidewalk a moment, the wind picking up leaves from somewhere, and thought that 15 minutes was a small thing to be given. Just directions, just a street name. He thought about the look on her face when she'd said it, though. Like it cost her something, like she'd handed him a piece of something she wasn't used to handing people. And he decided that it wasn't a small thing at all. He found Callaway Street on the drive home. She was right. 15 minutes. Easy. The thing about trust is that it doesn't arrive in one piece. It comes in increments. A small admission here, a dropped guard there, a moment where you say something true and the other person doesn't use it against you, and you file that away quietly. And the next time you say something a little truer, and the filing continues, and one day you look up and realize the distance between you and another person is significantly smaller than it used to be, and you're not entirely sure when it happened or whether to be relieved or frightened. Victoria had been filing things away for 6 weeks. She knew she was doing it. She was self-aware enough to recognize the process, which was its own specific kind of frustration. Knowing you're cautious doesn't make you less cautious. It just means you watch yourself being cautious and can't stop. She had a therapist, Dr. Renata Walsh, a dry and perceptive woman in her early 50s, who had been working with Victoria for 3 years and who had, in their last session, said with the particular restraint of someone exercising professional care, "It sounds like you're waiting for him to do something wrong so you can stop feeling this." And Victoria had said, "That's not what I'm doing." And Dr. Walsh had said nothing, because Dr. Walsh understood the value of silence in a way that Victoria both respected and found deeply inconvenient. She was, of course, waiting for him to do something wrong. Not maliciously, not even consciously most of the time. But somewhere underneath the Saturdays at Clement's and the evening texts about Gerald's legal education, and the conversations that kept finding new rooms she hadn't known were there, underneath all of that was the part of her that had been here before and knew how it ended. And that part was watching Nathan Cole with the patient, tired vigilance of a person who had learned that the pleasant surface of things was rarely the whole story. The problem was, 6 weeks in, she hadn't found the thing underneath. And the absence of the thing was almost harder to manage than the thing would have been. It was a Tuesday evening in December when Nathan called instead of texting, which was different, and Victoria answered from her office where she was still working at 7:45 because she was usually still working at 7:45. "Sophie wants to know if you've eaten," he said, without preamble. Victoria looked at the takeout container on the corner of her desk that she'd ordered 2 hours ago and not opened. "Tell Sophie I'm fine. She'll want specifics. Tell Sophie I have food in front of me. That's different from eating it. Nathan, I'm not policing your dinner. Sophie is, apparently." Victoria almost smiled. "Why is Sophie interested in whether I've eaten? She asked me this afternoon if you were my friend, and I said yes, and she said, 'Do you make sure she eats?' Because apparently that's what you do for friends, according to Sophie, who had to be reminded at lunch today to finish her own sandwich." Victoria was quiet for a moment. The office was quiet around her. Most of her staff had gone home, the lights on the floor dimmed to their evening setting. "She asked about me?" "She asks about you most days, actually." He said it easily, factually, like it was just a thing that was true. Not in a, "She's not anxious about it. She's just curious. She wants to know what you're like." "What do you tell her?" "That you're smart, and that you're funny even when you don't mean to be, and that you know a lot about things she hasn't learned about yet." A brief pause. "She wanted to know if you like rabbits. I told her Gerald had come up in conversation and you had opinions about his academic future. She was very pleased." Victoria looked out the window at the city lights below. She had a corner office on the 22nd floor, and the view was genuinely spectacular, and she almost never looked at it because there was almost always something on her desk more urgent than the view. "I haven't met her yet," she said. "No." "Is that... do you want that to happen?" "I think it's something we'd both need to be ready for," he said. "No pressure. I'm not saying it has to be now." "But you're saying it at all." "Yeah," he said. "I'm saying it at all." She turned away from the window. "Let me think about it." "Okay." "That's not a no." "I know," he said. "It sounds like a you." She did smile then, brief and private, in the empty office. "I'm going to eat my dinner now." "Good. Sophie will be relieved. Tell her Gerald sent his regards." "She'll lose her mind," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice before he hung up. She sat for a moment after, in the quiet office with the city below. Then she opened the takeout container. The food was cold. She ate it anyway. She told Dr. Walsh about the call the following Thursday. "And how did it make you feel?" Walsh asked, which was the therapist question that always made Victoria want to say something unhelpful. "Like I was being handled carefully," Victoria said. "Like someone was watching where they put their feet." "Is that negative?" "I don't know. Maybe it's just what it looks like when someone is being considerate." She said the word like she was examining it for defects. "I'm not used to it reading as genuine. Usually when someone is that careful around me, it's because they want something." "What do you think he wants?" "I've been trying to figure that out for 6 weeks, and I can't." She shifted in the chair. He's not after the money. He's never asked about the company. He's never positioned himself near the financial side of my life at all. If anything, he's slightly uncomfortable when it comes up. Uncomfortable how? Not in a resentful way. More like, he doesn't want me to think that's what he's there for, so he creates distance from it. She paused. Which is its own form of managing the impression. But it doesn't feel calculated. It feels more like pride. He's proud of what he does, and he doesn't want the scale of what I have to make it smaller. Walsh wrote something. Victoria had always wanted to know what she wrote and had never asked. And what do you want from him? She opened her mouth to answer, and then stopped because the answer was right there, and she hadn't quite looked at it directly before, and it was both simpler and more complicated than she'd expected. I want to stop waiting for the thing underneath, she said. I want to just be there, without the accounting, without the calculation. She looked at her hands. I don't know if I remember how to do that. What would it require? Trusting that what I see is what's there. A quiet beat. That's harder than it sounds. For most people, Walsh said, yes. The conversation she'd been circling for weeks finally happened on a Wednesday night, not in person, which was both easier and harder. Nathan had texted earlier asking if he could call that evening, which was itself a shift. He usually just called when he had something to say. The pre-announcement was new, and Victoria had spent most of the workday intermittently noticing it. She was in her apartment when he called, on the couch with her shoes off and a glass of water she kept meaning to drink. December had settled fully into the city, and the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse showed a dark sky above the lights. I want to say something, and I want to say it straight, he said when she answered. No preamble, which she'd learned to expect from him. Okay, she said. I've been thinking about what you told me, about your last relationship, the guy. He paused. And I want to be clear about something, I'm not making a speech. I just want to say it once, plainly, so it's said. She pulled her feet up under her on the couch. Say it. I'm not embarrassed to be around you, he said. Not in public, not with people I know, not with Sophie. The size of it, I mean. What you look like. None of that is something I think about in the way that guy apparently did, and I want you to know that's not me managing my reaction or making a decision to be decent about it. It's not the thing. You're the thing. A long silence. Nathan. I know it might sound like something people say. It does sound like that, she said. Her voice was steady, but something in her chest was not. People say things like that. I know, but I've been sitting with this for a few weeks, and I didn't want to say it too soon because I thought it would sound like I was trying to score a point. But now I'm worried that waiting has made it sound calculated, so I'm just saying it, and it's going to sound how it sounds. She pressed her lips together. Why are you telling me this now? Because Diane told me what she told me about your history, and I've been knowing it and not saying anything. And the not saying it was starting to feel like its own kind of dishonesty. He paused. I don't want to be dishonest with you, even by omission. She stared at the city through the glass. Diane shouldn't have told you that. Maybe not, but I'm glad she did. Why? Because it made me understand something that I was... He stopped. I was taking your self-sufficiency at face value, which was its own kind of inattention. You're very good at seeming fine. I was letting you seem fine instead of looking at what was underneath it. Victoria sat very still. Outside, the city was its usual constant hum, 22 floors below, indifferent and alive. There's a thing I do, she said after a moment. I've done it my whole life. When someone is unkind to me, when someone says something or does something that's specifically meant to diminish me, I make my face completely neutral, and I finish the conversation, and then I go home and I'm fine. And I've spent so long being fine in those moments that I think I've gotten genuinely confused about whether I actually am or whether I'm just very good at the performance. Which is it tonight? He asked quietly. A long pause. I don't know, she said. Both, maybe. That's okay. Is it? Yeah, he said. Being confused about that is pretty human, actually. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. I'm not used to someone telling me that the confused version of me is acceptable. The confused version of you is better than the polished version of most people I've met, he said, and the simplicity of it, the way he said it like it was just arithmetic, was what got her. Not the compliment, the matter-of-factness of it. She put her hand over her mouth briefly, not because she was crying, because she wasn't, but because something had loosened in her chest that she'd been keeping compressed for a long time, and she needed a moment with it. I'm not very good at this part, she said. Her voice was slightly different than it had been, less managed. The letting it be real part. Neither am I, he said. I'm 32 and I eat dinner alone 4 nights a week, and my best attempt at a love life for the last 2 years has been explaining to my daughter why Gerald shouldn't date until he's finished his education. She laughed, properly, the full one. That's good parenting, actually. I thought so. They were quiet for a moment, the comfortable kind. Tell me something true, she said. It came out before she'd planned it. Right now? Yes. A pause. I think about what it would be like to not always go home alone, he said. Not in a desperate way. Just, I notice the absence. I've gotten good at the absence, but I still notice it. She closed her eyes for a second. Yes, she said softly. I know that exactly. Tell me something true, he said. She thought. Not about what would sound right, but about what was actually true, which was harder. I've been looking for the thing underneath with you, she said. The hidden calculation, the reason. She paused. I haven't found it. And I keep looking, and I can't find it, and I think I need to consider the possibility that there isn't one. There isn't, he said. I'm considering it, she said. That's as far as I can get tonight. That's far enough, he said. She met Sophie on a Saturday afternoon in mid-December at a small natural history museum near the university district that had a permanent exhibit on local geology, which was Sophie's current obsession, the rocks having evolved from a private collection into a structured intellectual interest that Nathan found both impressive and slightly exhausting. Victoria had been nervous in a way she hadn't expected to be nervous. She was used to high-stakes situations. She had presented to rooms full of institutional investors and chaired board meetings where the outcome affected hundreds of jobs, and navigated the specific controlled tension of being the youngest, and often the only woman, and always the largest person in rooms that had decided before she arrived what they thought of her. She had a practiced stillness in high-pressure situations that her team considered a professional superpower. She was nervous about a 7-year-old. She'd told Nathan this bluntly on the phone the previous evening, and he'd been quiet for a moment and then said, She's going to like you, and even if she didn't, which she will, you'd be okay. She's just a kid, not a performance review. And Victoria had said, I know, and known that knowing it wasn't the same as feeling it, and he'd said, just be normal. She'll do the rest. Just be normal was the kind of advice that sounded simple and wasn't, but she'd held on to it anyway. Sophie was smaller than Victoria had pictured, which was irrational because, of course, she'd be small. She was 7. She had Nathan's coloring, the same direct dark eyes, and she was wearing a jacket with a small dinosaur embroidered on the pocket, and she was carrying a notebook that she explained, immediately and without introduction, was for recording the names of rocks she hadn't seen before. I'm Sophie, she said, looking up at Victoria with the uncomplicated appraisal of a child who hadn't yet learned to disguise curiosity as something more polite. You're Victoria. I am, Victoria said. Dad says you know about money. Nathan, standing just behind his daughter, closed his eyes briefly. Victoria caught it. I know some things about it, Victoria said. Do rocks have money value? Some of them do. Diamonds are technically rocks. Sophie considered this with the gravity it deserved. Gerald says property law is more interesting than finance law, she said, but he's not sure yet. Victoria looked at this small, serious person standing in front of her with her dinosaur jacket and her notebook, and felt something in her chest shift completely without warning. I think Gerald should keep his options open, she said. The best lawyers tend to move between disciplines. Sophie nodded slowly, processing. Then she looked up. Do you want to see the igneous rocks? They're the ones made by volcanoes. Yes, Victoria said. I really do. They went to the igneous rocks. Nathan walked slightly behind them, watching his daughter explain the difference between basalt and obsidian to a billionaire CEO who was listening with what appeared to be genuine interest, and he felt the particular complicated warmth of a moment that is better than you let yourself hope it would be. It wasn't perfect. Sophie, about 40 minutes in, said something about how Victoria was really big, with the benign, unembarrassed observation of a child who was noting a fact rather than making a judgment, and Victoria went still for half a second in the way Nathan had learned to recognize, that practiced stillness, before she said simply, "I am. It's a good thing to be, actually. Takes up more space." And Sophie had considered this and said, "Like a mountain," and moved on to the sedimentary section without further comment. Nathan caught Victoria's eye over Sophie's head. She held his gaze for a moment. The stillness was gone, replaced by something lighter, and when she turned back to follow Sophie to the next display, she was almost smiling. They ate lunch at the museum cafe afterward. Sophie had a grilled cheese, Victoria and Nathan both had soup, and Sophie spent most of lunch explaining to Victoria her current theory that Gerald would need a law clerk who was also a rabbit, for ethical reasons that were internally consistent if you accepted the premise. Victoria engaged with this theory with complete seriousness and asked clarifying questions, and at one point offered a counterargument that Sophie rejected on procedural grounds. And Nathan sat across from them and ate his soup and thought, with a quiet and slightly overwhelming clarity, that he was in trouble. Not bad trouble, but the kind of trouble that changes the shape of things. The kind where you look at a moment happening in front of you and know that when you're on the other side of it, something will be permanently different. After lunch, Sophie needed the bathroom, and Nathan stood with Sophie a few paces away at the entrance while Victoria waited. And Sophie looked up at him and said very conversationally, "I like her." "Yeah," Nathan said. "She's smart," Sophie said. "And she listened to the whole Gerald theory, even the part about the co-counsel." She tugged at her jacket zipper. "Devin never listens to the whole Gerald theory. Devin has a limited attention span." "Victoria listened to all of it," Sophie said again, as if this confirmed something important. Then she went into the bathroom. Nathan walked back to where Victoria was standing near a display case of mineral samples, looking at a piece of rose quartz without quite seeing it. He stopped beside her. "She likes you," he said. Victoria kept looking at the quartz. "I heard. Acoustics in here." "Yes." A pause. "She's a good kid, Nathan." "She really is." Victoria turned from the display case and looked at him. They were standing close, museum close, the involuntary proximity of standing near exhibit cases, and her expression was open in a way he hadn't seen from her before. Not managed, not prepared. "I didn't expect that," she said. "Which part?" She thought about it. "Any of it, really. The afternoon in general." A pause. "The way it felt to be here." "How did it feel?" She looked at him steadily. "Like something I've been missing the shape of for a long time," she said. Without knowing, it was a shape. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her. "Okay," he said finally, quietly, giving her word back to her. And she understood it the same way he'd understood it when she used it, not as a small word, but as a large one that had chosen a small form. The bathroom door opened and Sophie reappeared with her notebook, already open to a new page, already moving toward the next exhibit. "Metamorphic," she called back at them, because apparently that was where they were going now. Victoria and Nathan followed. Her shoulder bumped his arm slightly as they turned the corner into the next room. Close quarters, narrow museum hallway, not a calculated gesture. She didn't move away. Neither did he. Outside, an hour later, in the gray December light of the museum's front steps, Sophie was already at the bottom landing examining a piece of gravel with scholarly intensity, and Nathan and Victoria stood at the top and watched her. "I'm not waiting for the thing underneath anymore," Victoria said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on Sophie. "I decided. I don't want to waste more time on the accounting." He was quiet beside her. "That's not me making a declaration," she said. "It's just, I wanted to say it out loud, to someone who would know what it meant." "I know what it means," he said. She nodded, still watching Sophie, who had now apparently found a piece of gravel interesting enough to put in her notebook, which said something either about the gravel or about Sophie. "She's going to get that gravel on everything," Nathan said. "Probably," Victoria said. They stood there another moment, in the cold, watching a 7-year-old crouch on a museum sidewalk and take notes about a piece of gravel, and neither of them moved to leave, because there was nowhere else either of them particularly wanted to be. The gravel piece ended up on Nathan's kitchen windowsill. Sophie had placed it there with ceremony the evening after the museum, wedged between a dead succulent Nathan kept meaning to throw away, and a coffee mug with a hairline crack he kept meaning to replace, and she had labeled it in her notebook as Museum Sidewalk, December, gray, possibly limestone, and declared it part of her permanent collection. Nathan had not objected. The windowsill had room. Everything in the apartment had room, eventually, because Sophie had a talent for finding it. Victoria had texted him that night, late, past 11, which he'd learned was when she did her clearest thinking because the workday noise had finally dropped away. "I had a good afternoon." A pause, and then, "Sophie told me the gravel might be limestone." She seemed to consider this meaningful. He'd written back, "She considers most rocks meaningful. I've stopped questioning the framework." "Good parenting," Victoria had replied. And then, "I keep thinking about the mountain thing." He'd needed a second to place it. Then he'd remembered, Sophie, the display case, like a mountain. "Me too," he wrote. 3 small words, but he'd meant them in the fullest way available to 3 small words. Well, January came in cold and flat, the way January comes in cities that don't bother softening the transition from the holidays. The Saturday coffee routine held, mostly, interrupted twice by a board meeting Victoria couldn't reschedule, and once by Sophie getting a winter cold that turned the apartment into a small, miserable infirmary for 4 days. Nathan had texted Victoria from the couch on the second sick day with, "Soup report. Homemade chicken. Consumed under protest. Gerald is also ill, apparently. Solidarity." Victoria had sent back, "Professional opinion. Gerald should stay hydrated. Also, do you need anything?" He'd looked at that message for a moment, "Do you need anything?" and felt the small, specific weight of it. Not the grand gesture kind of caring, the practical kind. The kind that is actually harder to offer because it makes the offer real. "We're okay," he'd written, "but thank you." She'd replied, "I mean it, if you need anything." He'd believed her. That was the thing. He'd believed her without a second check. It was Diane who, with the reliable timing of a woman who had been waiting for a specific moment and recognized it when it arrived, invited them both to a dinner party in late January. Not an arranged blind situation this time. A genuine gathering, 8 people, Diane and Marcus's house, the comfortable chaos of a dinner among people who actually knew each other. Nathan and Victoria, arriving separately and ending up at the door at the same time by accident, stood on the front step in the cold for a moment. "Callaway Street?" he asked. "Obviously," she said. "You?" "I remembered." She almost smiled. He rang the bell. The evening was different from the restaurant in October in every meaningful way. Nathan knew most of the people. Victoria knew Diane. The conversation was looser, louder, the kind that happens in a living room rather than a private dining room. And there was no fillip, no careful choreography, no performance review disguised as a dinner party. Someone burned the garlic bread and the kitchen filled with smoke briefly, and everyone pretended it hadn't happened and then laughed about it. And Marcus told a story about a camping trip that required 3 separate corrections from Diane to reach its actual conclusion, and the evening was just normal. Warm and imperfect and normal. Victoria, Nathan noticed, was different here than she'd been at the restaurant in October. Less armored. Still composed in the particular way she was always composed, but the quality of the composure was different. It wasn't the armor kind. It was the settled kind. The kind that comes not from bracing yourself, but from being somewhere you've decided is safe enough. She sat beside him at the table. Their elbows touched twice. Neither of them moved. Later, after dinner, when the group had split into the living room configurations of post-meal conversation, Nathan found himself in the kitchen refilling water glasses while Diane stood at the counter with her wine, watching him with the expression of someone who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Diane, I'm just..." She sipped her wine. Observing. That's what people say before they say the actual thing. She smiled, and it was fond and slightly smug in equal measure. You're happy tonight. He set down the water pitcher. I'm fine. Nathan, you have the face. What face? The one you used to have before. She stopped herself, adjusted. You haven't had it in a while. That's all I'm saying. She picked up her wine and moved toward the door and then stopped. She's different too, you know, since you. She shrugged, casual, like it was a minor observation. Just so you know. She went back to the living room. Nathan stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then he went back too, and he found Victoria near the bookshelf talking to James about something infrastructure adjacent, some development project in the news, and she glanced over at him when he came in, just briefly, the way you glance at a person whose presence you've been aware of even when you weren't looking. He refilled her water glass when he passed. She didn't make a thing of it. He didn't either, but she caught his eye when he sat back down, and there was something in her face, quiet, real, unhurried, that said she'd noticed. He looked back at her for just a second, and she looked away first, and neither of them said anything about it, and that was its own kind of language. The fracture, when it came from a direction neither of them had been watching. It was a Friday evening in early February. Victoria was at a client dinner, one of those long, obligatory financial industry evenings that she described to Nathan as functional misery, when she got a call from her COO, Derek Haynes, a man she trusted with the operational side of the company and had trusted for 3 years. She'd stepped out of the dinner briefly, answered, listened, and then stood in the hallway of a restaurant she'd attended 40 similar dinners in and felt the specific cold clarity of a professional situation that had quietly become a personal one. The story, as Derek explained it, was this. A journalist at a financial trade publication was working on a profile piece about sterling asset management. Standard industry coverage, the kind the firm had navigated before, nothing exceptional. The journalist had reached out to several sources. One of the sources, someone who had apparently been watching Victoria's personal life with more attention than she'd realized, had offered the journalist not just professional background, but personal commentary. Specifically, commentary about her weight, about how she'd let herself go further in recent years, about whether a CEO who couldn't manage her own health could be trusted to manage other people's money. The source had added, with what the journalist described as casual confidence, that Victoria's personal life was in a strange place, and that she'd recently been seen around town with someone clearly out of her league specified in the financial sense, the journalist had noted carefully, not wanting to be unclear about the nature of the cruelty. The journalist wasn't going to run the personal material. She'd told Derek directly that it was outside the scope and below the standard she worked to, but she was calling as a professional courtesy to let the firm know the commentary was circulating. Because in this industry, a courtesy call about circulating commentary was itself a message. Victoria had gone back to the client dinner. She'd finished the evening. She'd said goodnight to 4 people whose names she'd known for years, gotten into her car, gone home, and sat on her couch in her coat for 20 minutes without taking it off. She didn't call Nathan that night. She sat with it. She called Dr. Walsh at 8 the next morning, a Saturday, and Walsh answered because she was a good therapist and knew Victoria well enough to recognize the weight of an 8 a.m. call. Someone is talking, Victoria said. Someone is always talking, Walsh said carefully. Someone who knows me. Someone with enough access to know that I've been seeing someone and enough spite to weaponize it. She paused. And I don't know if the target was me or him. What do you mean? The out-of-his-league comment. That was directed at him, not me. Someone is trying to make Nathan look like he's got an angle, like he's after something. She pressed her hand flat against the couch cushion, which means someone knows about him, and they chose to use him. A silence. How does that make you feel? Angry, she said immediately. And then underneath the angry, scared. Because he didn't sign up for this. He didn't agree to be someone's ammunition. Have you told him? No? Are you going to? She stared at the window. The morning was gray. If I tell him, she said slowly, he'll understand it. He'll be decent about it. That's not what I'm worried about. What are you worried about? That he'll start to understand what it actually costs to be around me, she said. The specific tax. The being scrutinized and commented on and folded into someone else's narrative without your consent, she exhaled. He's a private person. He has Sophie. He has a normal life. And I don't... She stopped. I don't know if I have the right to ask him to absorb that. Walsh was quiet for a moment. Is that your decision to make alone? She didn't answer. Victoria, Walsh said, is that his decision or yours? She sat with that question for the rest of the morning. She called Nathan that afternoon and asked if he could come over. She'd never asked that before, Their geography had always been neutral, coffee shops and public spaces, the careful equidistance of people who hadn't yet established whose territory the relationship lived in. He said yes, immediately, no elaboration required, and she gave him the address and buzzed him up 40 minutes later. He'd been to the building before. He'd dropped her off once when her car service was delayed, waited outside in his Civic while she went in, but he'd never been inside. She watched his face do the small recalibration that she'd learned to expect from anyone who came to the apartment for the first time. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread below, the rooms that were beautiful in the particular way that rooms are beautiful when someone with real resources and genuine taste has furnished them over time. He took it in without comment, which she appreciated, and then he looked at her instead of the view, which she appreciated more. You sounded off on the phone, he said. I'll tell you. Do you want anything to drink? I'm fine, she told him. All of it. Derek's call, the journalist's courtesy, the commentary about her weight, the out-of-his-league framing. She sat on the couch, and he sat in the chair across from her, and she told it in the flat, precise way she told hard things. And when she was finished, she looked at him and waited. He was quiet for a moment, processing, not avoiding. Do you know who it is? He asked. I have a short list. What are you going to do? Professionally, manage it. I've managed worse. She paused. That's not what I called you about. I know. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees, looking at her directly. You called to tell me it affects me, too. Yes. And to see if I'd... What? Back off? Get scared? She held his gaze. To give you the information and let you make a choice with it. Not to manage your reaction for you. She said it steadily. That was important to me. He nodded slowly. Someone's trying to make it look like I'm with you for the money. Yes. Because that's the only version of this that makes sense to them. That's the only version that makes sense in this industry, apparently. He looked out at the city for a moment, the first time he'd looked at the view since he came in. Then he looked back at her. You know that's not... I know, she said. That's not what I'm worried about. Then what? You have a daughter, she said simply. You have a private life. You have a kid who told a 7-year-old that she likes to eat dinner alone. If being around me pulls that life into a public narrative, into someone's ammunition, that's a cost. And you didn't know the cost when you started, and I'm not sure it's fair. A long pause. Victoria, he said, can I ask you something? Yes. Who made this decision for you? The one where you were going to handle the cost assessment and then tell me what you decided. She opened her mouth and then closed it. Because I'm 32, he said, still calm, still direct. I'm not a kid you have to protect from information. If there's a cost to being around you, I get to decide if it's one I'm willing to pay. That's not your call. I was trying to be fair to you. No, he said gently. You were trying to give yourself a graceful exit if you needed one. If you decide the cost is too high, for me, for Sophie, for whatever reason, you can hand me the cost assessment and say, this is why. And that would be you making the decision and giving me the paperwork. He paused. Is that what you're doing? Silence. No, she said quietly. Then what are you doing? She looked at her hands. I'm scared, she said. That's all. I'm scared that you'll look at this and do the math and decide it doesn't add up, and I'd rather be the one who gives you the numbers than the one who waits and finds out. He was quiet for a moment, then he stood up from the chair, crossed the room, and sat beside her on the couch. Not theatrical, not grand. Just a man crossing a room and sitting down. "I've already done the math," he said. "I've been doing it since October." He turned to look at her. "The number I keep getting is the same one." She looked at him. Her face was open in the way she'd learned to let it be open around him. Less defended, more present. "What number?" she asked. "That this is worth it," he said. "Whatever it costs. That's the number." She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at him with the kind of sustained attention that had nothing to do with measuring or calculating, just looking, seeing. "You're infuriating," she said finally. "I know." "Because you mean it." "Yeah." She exhaled, long, slow, the release of something she'd been holding since Friday night. "Okay," she said, the word in its fullest meaning. They sat on the couch and didn't touch, and it was fine. The city turned below them, indifferent and alive, and the afternoon light shifted slowly across the room. "The source," Nathan said, after a while. "Do you want to talk through who it might be?" "In a minute," she said. She hadn't moved. "Let me just sit here for a minute." "Okay." "You don't have to stay." "I know." He didn't move either. "I want to." She looked at the window. At the city she'd been looking at from this window for 4 years, alone on this couch in this apartment, doing the end-of-day accounting she'd told him about. Enough, too much, wrong, right, space, fault. The arithmetic of a person who had learned the hard way to manage the ledger herself, because leaving it unmanaged meant other people filled it in for you. "I haven't let anyone up here before," she said. Not dramatically, just as a fact. He looked at her. "I know," he said, and she understood he didn't just mean the apartment. Mass. The source turned out to be a former senior analyst named Craig Whitmore, who had worked at Sterling Asset for 2 years before Victoria had terminated him for cause 8 months ago. A performance issue she'd given him 3 opportunities to correct, and he hadn't. A severance package that was generous beyond obligation, and an exit that she'd handled with more grace than the situation probably warranted. He'd apparently decided that grace was a vulnerability. Derek confirmed it a week later. The journalist, to her professional credit, had traced the commentary back to source and reached out to Derek directly. Craig Whitmore had given the journalist the out-of-his-league line with the specific casualness of a man who thought casual cruelty was safe because it was delivered without obvious malice. Victoria had sat with this information for 2 days before she called her attorney. She didn't tell Nathan immediately, not because she was managing him, but because she needed to think it through clearly before she spoke it aloud, and she was learning the difference between those two things. When she did tell him, she told him the whole thing, including the part where her first instinct had been to manage it quietly and make it disappear because that was what she'd always done. She was good at making unpleasant things disappear through competence and silence and sheer force of will. But her attorney had said that quiet disappearance was not always in her interest, and Dr. Walsh had said something she kept turning over. The pattern of absorbing the cost yourself is a habit. It doesn't mean it's the right choice. "What are you going to do?" Nathan asked. "My attorney is sending a letter. It won't be a comfortable letter to receive." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. I'm done with that approach." He nodded. "Good. It'll probably surface somewhere. There might be coverage." "Victoria, I just want you to be prepared." "Victoria," he said again, steadily, "I'm prepared." She stopped. "You keep giving me these briefings," he said, "like you're my commanding officer and I need to be ready for the field." There was no edge in it, just honesty. "I'm with you. Not next to you with an escape route. With you. You can stop briefing me." She was quiet. "I'm still learning," she said. It cost her something to say it. She could feel it cost her. But she said it anyway. "I know," he said. "Me too." The letter went. Nathan was not briefed further. He was, instead, called on a Tuesday evening and told by a slightly tired, slightly relieved Victoria that Whitmore had responded through his own attorney and that the situation was being addressed, and that she'd had 3 glasses of water and 1 glass of wine tonight in honor of the event, and that she wanted to talk about something other than the whole thing for a while, which was fine, which was good, which was something that a person says when they have someone to call. They talked for an hour and a half about nothing important. About Sophie's current reading list, which had expanded dramatically. About a podcast Victoria had started listening to during her commute that was either very interesting or a complete waste of time, and she hadn't decided yet. About the drainage project Nathan was finishing up, which had gone 3 weeks over timeline, which he had predicted quietly 8 weeks ago. "Did you tell them?" Victoria asked. "I wrote it in the project notes. At the time." "So you have documentation?" "I always have documentation." "That's good project management." "It's also very satisfying," he said, and she laughed, and the laugh carried across the phone line easy and unguarded and real. It was past 10 when they finally said goodnight. Nathan sat in the quiet of the apartment after Sophie was asleep. The city muffled through the windows, the kitchen light on, Gerald propped on the counter in the vicinity of the limestone rock from the museum sidewalk. He thought about Victoria sitting on that couch in that apartment with the city below, and about the way she'd said, "I haven't let anyone up here before." Not the apartment, under the apartment. And about what it took to say that. What it cost. How long she'd been paying that particular kind of cost in silence, because silence had been the only option available. He thought about what she'd said to him on the museum steps. "I'm not waiting for the thing underneath anymore." He thought about the February afternoon on the couch, the city turning below them, and her voice saying, "Let me just sit here for a minute," not as retreat, but as arrival. The sound of a person who had been moving towards something for a long time and had finally stopped moving because they were there. He turned off the kitchen light. He checked on Sophie, who was asleep with Gerald's courtroom cousin, a bear named Harold, who had recently been introduced into the legal practice, tucked under her arm. He went to bed. He slept, as he had every night since December, without noticing the quiet. March came in quietly, the way months do when you've stopped measuring time the way you used to. Nathan noticed it one morning while making coffee. The specific, unremarkable Tuesday morning quality of standing in his kitchen, Sophie still asleep, the city outside the window doing its early routine of garbage trucks and distant sirens, and the particular birdsong of urban birds who have adapted to traffic noise and no longer seem bothered by any of it. He noticed that he was not doing the thing he used to do in the mornings, which was a kind of low-grade accounting of the day ahead and what it would cost and what it might return. He was just making coffee. The absence of the accounting was so complete that he had to stand there for a moment and recognize what the absence was. He thought about Victoria, not in the anxious way, not the weighing and measuring way, just thought about her the way you think about a person who has become part of the regular texture of your life, the person you want to tell things to, the person whose laugh you hear in your head when something is funny, the person whose specific brand of directness you've started to miss when 3 days pass without it. He thought about her, and then he poured his coffee and went to wake Sophie up for school, and it was ordinary and warm and exactly right. That was how he knew. Not the dramatic version of knowing, no single cinematic moment with light coming through a window at the perfect angle, just the Tuesday morning version, which was quieter and more durable, and he thought probably more honest about what love actually is when it isn't performing for anyone. The Hartwell Foundation Charity Gala was an annual event that Victoria had been attending for 4 years, first as a donor, then as a board member of the Foundation's advisory committee, which sounded more impressive than it was, she'd told Nathan, since advisory committees mostly advised each other in circles and then rubber-stamped whatever the executive director had already decided. She went because the Foundation's work in childhood literacy was genuinely good work, and because she'd learned early in her professional life that presence mattered even when the presence was mostly ceremonial, and because she admitted to Nathan with the dry precision he'd come to love, the catering was reliably excellent. She hadn't planned to bring Nathan, not because she didn't want him there. She did want him there. She'd known that for weeks, the way you know things before you let yourself say them. She hadn't planned to bring him because the gala was a particular kind of environment. Photographed, socially charged, populated by people whose primary recreational activity was noticing and commenting on things, and she was aware, in the specific and practiced way she was aware of such things, that arriving with Nathan would generate exactly the kind of attention she'd spent years trying to move through invisibly. She'd been sitting with this consideration for 2 weeks when Sophie made it irrelevant. She was at Nathan's apartment. This had become a thing. She went to the apartment. She sat at the kitchen table while Nathan cooked. Sophie showed her rocks and dictated updates about Gerald's academic progress. And Victoria had slowly, and without quite deciding to, had become a presence in the apartment the way a piece of furniture becomes a presence, not intrusive, just there, belonging. And Sophie had looked up from her homework and said, with complete conversational casualness, "Are you going to the fancy party with Dad?" Victoria had looked at Nathan. Nathan had looked at his cutting board. "I'm going to a gala next month," Victoria said carefully, "for a literacy foundation." "Dad likes literacy," Sophie offered. "Most people do," Victoria said. "He reads to me every night." Sophie returned to her homework, then looked up again. "You should bring him. Fancy parties are better with someone." Nathan was still looking at his cutting board. Victoria was almost certain his shoulders were shaking slightly. "I'll think about it," Victoria said. "You should," Sophie said, with the uncomplicated authority of a child who had assessed the situation and reached a conclusion. "He has a good suit." "I do have a good suit," Nathan confirmed, still not looking up. Victoria sat at the kitchen table and thought, not for the first time, that Sophie Cole was going to be a formidable human being when she was grown, and that the world would not know what hit it. She asked Nathan that evening, after Sophie was in bed, standing in the kitchen while he washed the dishes, a domestic scene so ordinary and so quietly right that she'd had to look away from it for a moment to compose herself. "The gala," she said, "the Hartwell Foundation thing, in April." He turned off the tap. "Yeah? I want you to come." She said it straight, no qualifier, no management. "Not if you feel obligated. I want you to come because I want you there." He dried his hands on the dish towel and turned around and looked at her. "Okay," he said. "It'll be photographed. People will notice." "Victoria." "I know," he said. "You're briefing me again." She stopped. "I know it'll be photographed," he said. "I know people will notice. I don't care." He held her gaze. "Do you?" A pause. "I care," she said honestly. "Not because of me. I stopped caring about myself in those rooms a long time ago. I don't want anyone to say something about you, or use you, or... And if they do?" She looked at him. "If they do," he said, "then they do. And we deal with it." He said "we" with the easy weight of a word that's earned its meaning. "I'm not made of glass, Victoria." She knew he wasn't. She'd known that for months. The knowing hadn't fully reached the part of her that still wanted to protect things that were important to her from the specific shrapnel of the life she'd built. "Okay," she said. "That's my word," he said. "I'm borrowing it." He smiled. She thought, not for the first time, that Nathan Cole had an extremely unfair smile. But April arrived. The gala was on a Saturday, which meant Sophie's afternoon had to be arranged. She went to Marcus and Diane's, which Sophie regarded as essentially a vacation, since Marcus had a dog named Bucket who permitted the kind of sustained roughhousing that Nathan's apartment did not accommodate. Sophie departed with her overnight bag and her notebook and a list of questions she'd prepared for Bucket, the efficacy of which Nathan did not inquire about. Nathan wore the suit. It was a dark navy, well-fitted, the kind of suit a man owns when he doesn't own many suits, but knows the one he has should be right. Victoria had seen him in it for 30 seconds at his door and had said simply, "Good suit," and he'd said, "Sophie called it," and they'd gotten in the car. She was wearing deep burgundy, a dress that had been made for her by the tailor she'd mentioned at the dinner back in October, fitted and elegant and entirely herself. And Nathan had looked at her across the car and thought of the night she'd walked into the private dining room at Arden, and he'd seen, underneath the composed surface, the loneliness that she'd gotten so good at carrying. No one else seemed to notice it anymore. He looked at her now, and the composure was still there. It was always going to be there. It was part of how she was built. But the loneliness was not, or not in the same way. "You look beautiful," he said. She looked at him, not with deflection, not with the small retreat she'd have made 6 months ago from a direct compliment delivered without irony. She just looked at him. "Thank you," she said. Straight. He'd learned by now that for Victoria, receiving something without deflecting it was its own kind of courage. The Hartwell Gala was held in the ballroom of the Alderton Hotel, a venue that had been hosting this particular kind of event for 30 years and knew exactly what it was doing, which meant everything was beautiful and nothing was comfortable, and the lighting was specifically designed to make everyone feel like they were being subtly evaluated, which they were. They arrived and the cameras came. The Foundation's photographer, the 2 or 3 freelance society photographers who followed these events like professional weather systems. And Nathan stood beside Victoria with his hand at the small of her back, not possessively, just present, just there. She felt it. She didn't lean away. The photographs would appear in 2 publications and 1 social media account over the following week. In all of them, Victoria Sterling was standing straight, chin level, wearing her composure the way she always wore it, and beside her was a man who looked, in every frame, like he was exactly where he'd decided to be. The inside of the event was the inside of these events everywhere. Warm rooms, important people performing the social labor of being important together, conversations that were 3 parts genuine and 1 part strategic, excellent food that no one was fully paying attention to. Victoria moved through it with the practiced ease of a woman who had been doing this since she was 24, greeting people, deflecting things, saying the right amount in every room. Nathan stayed close, not clinging, not hovering, just near enough that when she turned, he was there. The first comment came within 30 minutes, which was, Victoria would later tell Dr. Walsh, faster than she'd expected, even accounting for the ambient cattiness of these environments. It came from a woman named Sylvia Hartman, board member at 2 foundations, professional philanthropist, the kind of person who circulates at events like this with the specific energy of someone who has never once questioned whether she belongs in any room. She was in her mid-50s, expensively dressed, and she had known Victoria in the professional sense for 4 years in the way that certain people in certain industries know each other. Not friendship, not exactly hostility, just the long-running awareness of each other's presence. She looked at Nathan with a smile that was performing curiosity while actually performing something else entirely. Victoria, she said, I didn't know you were bringing someone. I didn't announce it, Victoria said pleasantly. And you are? The smile turned to Nathan. Nathan Cole, he said. And what do you do, Nathan? Civil engineering, he said. Infrastructure. Oh. The syllable carried a specific weight. Not rude enough to call out, weighted enough to land. How interesting. Her gaze slid briefly, assessing, and then back to Victoria with the expression of a woman filing something away. Well, it's lovely to have someone here supporting you, Victoria. I'm sure it's meaningful. She moved on. Victoria kept her face even. Her hand, at her side, had closed briefly around the fabric of her dress. The small, involuntary tell. Nathan watched Sylvia Hartman's retreating back for a moment. Then he looked at Victoria. Supporting you, he said. Yes, Victoria said. I noticed that too. Like you brought a volunteer. Sylvia Hartman views most people as accessories, Victoria said. It's her limitation, not a judgment worth carrying. That's very mature of you. I've had years of practice. She exhaled. Are you okay? I'm fine, he said. Are you? She looked at him. Yes, she said, and meant it. Let's get a drink. They moved on. The evening built the way these evenings build, slowly, by increments, an hour of circulation before the dinner program began. The room filling with the particular noise of people who have agreed to be in the same place and are making the best of the proximity. There were 2 more moments before dinner. One was a man named Fletcher Aldous, finance, old money, the kind of man whose social instincts had calcified into habit decades ago, who looked at Nathan during a conversation about the Foundation's annual report and said, with entirely genuine thoughtlessness, "So how did you 2 meet?" Through Victoria's charitable work. The implication being, Nathan supposed, that the most logical framework for his presence was as a beneficiary of Victoria's generosity rather than a person she'd chosen. Nathan had said, mildly, through mutual friends. Dinner party in October. Oh, Aldous said, slightly recalibrating. I see. And you're in civil engineering, Nathan said. Bridges, mostly. Right. A pause during which Aldous visibly tried to place this information in a framework that made sense to him and partially succeeded. Important work. It is, Nathan agreed. After Aldous moved on, Victoria looked at Nathan with the expression of a woman who had watched 2 rounds of this and was arriving at a feeling she hadn't quite expected. "You're very calm," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "These are small things. They accumulate." "Yes," he said. "I'm beginning to understand that." She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd looked at him on the museum steps, the way she'd looked at him on the couch in February. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." "Nathan, Victoria." He turned to face her properly, not making a scene, just direct. "I'm not apologizing for being here. Please don't apologize either." A pause. "Okay," she said. "There it is," he said quietly. She almost laughed. He caught it, the small arrested thing at the corner of her mouth. And that was the moment the evening shifted for him from something to get through to something he was actually present for. The dinner program began at 7:30. The Foundation's executive director spoke about the year's work, and the numbers were genuinely good. Thousands of children in underserved districts with access to books and reading programs that hadn't existed 3 years ago, and whatever else the evening was, that part was real and worth the room. Victoria applauded with the particular warmth she showed when things were actually good rather than performatively good. And Nathan noticed the difference and thought about the ways you learn a person. Not the facts of them, but the textures, the small tells, the difference between the public version and the version that shows up at 8 a.m. on a Saturday when she's been awake since 6 worrying about a quarterly review and lets herself be honest about it. He was thinking about this when the woman sat down beside him. Her name was Renata Park, late 40s, features writer for a city lifestyle magazine, the kind of journalist who covered these events with genuine curiosity rather than pure documentation. She introduced herself, mentioned the magazine, and asked if she could ask him a few questions, which Nathan had the right to decline and didn't, because he had nothing to hide, and declining questions had always struck him as a way of making things bigger than they needed to be. "You're here with Victoria Sterling," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "That's notable. She doesn't usually bring anyone to these." "I know," Nathan said. "How long have you been together?" He thought about how to answer that. "Since October, roughly." "And you're in civil engineering?" "Infrastructure, yeah. Bridge specs, mostly." She was writing, not on her phone, but in an actual small notebook, which Nathan found unexpectedly refreshing. What's that like, being in a relationship with someone at her level? The wealth gap, the public profile? He considered her. "You want an honest answer or a polished one?" She looked up. "Honest, if you're offering." "It's strange sometimes," he said. "Not in the way people probably assume, not uncomfortable, but I'm not sitting here wishing I made more money or feeling like a charity case. More just," he paused, finding it, "more just that the world keeps trying to put a frame around it that doesn't fit. Like the only story available is one where someone has an angle, or someone is slumming, or the whole thing is performing some function I can't see, and the actual story is just people. 2 people who met at dinner and found out they actually liked each other." Renata Park looked at him for a moment. "That's the honest version." "That's the only version I have." She wrote something. "And Victoria? How does she navigate the public side of it?" "You'd have to ask her that," he said. "But I'll say—" He stopped, decided. "She's the most capable person I've met. Not in the resume sense, in the she's been carrying things alone for a very long time and she's learned to make it look easy. And the thing about people who've learned to make hard things look easy is that everyone stops checking whether they're okay." He looked across the table to where Victoria was in conversation with the Foundation director, composed, attentive, exactly right. "She's okay. She's better than okay. I just think she deserves to have someone paying attention." Renata Park capped her pen. "Off the record," she said, "that's a good answer." "It's just the true one," Nathan said. The moment happened near the end of the evening. It came from a direction neither of them had been tracking, not Sylvia Hartman, not Fletcher Aldous, Not any of the people Nathan had quietly catalogued as the room's particular variety of ambient social difficulty. It came from a cluster of 3 people near the venue's main bar, 2 men in their 40s and a woman slightly older, all of them in the specific register of people who have attended many of these events and consider themselves arbiters of the room's quality. Nathan and Victoria were passing on their way from dinner back toward the main hall, and he heard it, or parts of it, the way you hear things not meant for you when a room is at a certain volume level, and people have had enough to drink to loosen the gap between thinking and saying. One of the men, the taller one, was talking with the specific careless confidence of a person who considers himself witty in private and has never quite learned where private ends. Not sure what the angle is, but there's clearly one. Men don't just... A gesture, vague and obvious. You know, for that. The woman laughed. No offense to her, she's built a remarkable company. I just don't think we're supposed to pretend... Victoria's pace didn't break. Her face didn't change. Her hand, which had been loose at her side, closed slightly. Nathan stopped walking. She realized he'd stopped after 2 steps and turned back, and her expression said don't. And he understood the don't. Understood that she'd had a calculation in place about how much public confrontation was worth and what it cost, and that she'd done the math, and the don't was the result of that math. He understood all of that. He looked at her for a second. Then he turned around and walked back the 3 steps to where the group of 3 was standing, and he stood there, and he waited the 2 seconds it took for them to realize he'd stopped, and when they looked at him, he looked at the taller man, the one who'd been talking. I heard you, Nathan said. His voice was what it always was in these moments, not raised, not heated, just direct, a fact. You were loud enough. The man's face rearranged itself into something that was trying to be unconcerned. I was having a private conversation. In a room full of people, Nathan said, so not very private. A pause. The woman's gaze had moved to somewhere over Nathan's shoulder. The second man was interested in his drink. I don't think I said anything that... You implied, Nathan said, that there has to be an angle, a reason, because otherwise the math doesn't work for you. He kept his voice level. I want to say this clearly, so there's no ambiguity. There's no angle. I'm here because she asked me to come. I'm with her because she's extraordinary, and because she's the most honest person I know, and because when I'm around her I'm a better version of myself than I am when I'm not. He paused. And I know that doesn't fit the frame you had available. I'm not going to apologize for that. The man opened his mouth. And for what it's worth, Nathan said, quieter, the remarkable company you mentioned. She built that. Herself. At 24. While people exactly like you told her she couldn't. So the next time you're going to compliment her in one breath and diminish her in the next, maybe just don't. He turned and walked back to Victoria. She was standing exactly where she'd been, 2 steps behind him, and her expression was doing several things at once, none of which she was managing. She was looking at him with the open, undefended face he'd first seen on a museum sidewalk in December, and underneath the composure there was something raw and real and completely unguarded that he thought she probably didn't show people very often. He stopped in front of her. Sorry, he said. I know you had a calculation. Stop, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment, the noise of the room around them, the chandeliers and the catering and the 100-odd people performing their social obligations in every direction. Nobody has ever done that, she said, in 8 years of these events. Not once. He was quiet. I have walked past 100 versions of that conversation, she said, and her voice was still careful, but the careful was doing more work than usual. And I have made my face neutral, and I have kept walking, and I have gone home, and I have been fine. And I had a plan to do that exact thing tonight. And you just... She stopped. You don't have to keep walking, he said. That's all. Her jaw moved slightly. She looked at the middle distance for a second, the practiced composure doing its work, and then she looked back at him, and something in her face settled. Not shut down, settled. Like a storm making landfall. Like something that has been held in suspension, finally completing its journey. I love you, she said. The 3 words came out like they'd been waiting behind a door she'd been holding closed for a long time, and had finally, quietly, stopped holding. Nathan looked at her. The room went on around them, indifferent and alive. "I know," he said softly. "I'm not. That wasn't calculated. That was—" "I know," he said again. "I know it wasn't." She exhaled. "I don't usually—" "Victoria." "Yes?" "I love you too," he said. "Since around December, probably. The museum. The gravel piece." She stared at him. "The gravel piece." "Sophie said you were like a mountain," he said, "and you didn't flinch. And I thought, that's the person. Right there." He shrugged slightly because he was Nathan, and declarations were not his natural environment, and the shrug was very him. "So, that's the timeline." She looked at him for a long, full moment. No calculation, no accounting, just looking. "You have terrible timing," she said. "I really do," he agreed. "In the middle of a charity gala. Not my best venue choice. In front of the bar." "Yes." A beat. She looked down briefly, then back up, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the chandeliers, and the real smile was there. The full one, the unmanaged one, the one she'd learned she was allowed to have around him. "Okay," she said. And then, because she'd been using the word long enough now that it had become its own private language between them. "Okay." He took her hand. Not a performance. They weren't facing the room. They weren't making a point. The photographers had moved to the other side of the ballroom. Just a man taking a woman's hand in a room full of people, quietly and completely, because she was the person he'd chosen, and that was the whole story. Her fingers closed around his. They stood there for a moment, the gala going on around them, and neither of them moved to leave, because there was nowhere else either of them particularly needed to be. The photographs from the Hartwell Gala that ran in Renata Parks magazine 2 weeks later did not tell the story of an angle or a calculation or a wealth gap or any of the frames the room had tried to apply to them over the course of the evening. They showed Victoria Sterling standing straight, chin level, in deep burgundy, and beside her a man in a navy suit who was looking at her the way people look at things they have chosen clearly and do not regret. There was one photograph in particular, not the posed one, not the arrival shot, that Renata Park had taken herself, the small notebook in her bag and her phone in her hand near the end of the evening. Victoria and Nathan, near the bar, facing each other, his hand in hers, the room around them all motion and noise, the two of them still in it. She ran the photograph without commentary, which was its own kind of statement. The gravel piece stayed on the kitchen windowsill. Beside it, eventually, a second piece appeared. Something Victoria brought back from a weekend in Connecticut where she'd taken Nathan and Sophie to see the house she almost never used. And Sophie had determined that the property's geological composition required documentation, and they had spent an afternoon following a 7-year-old through overgrown grass while she assessed rocks with great seriousness. That piece was darker than the first, basalt or something close to it, and Sophie labeled it Connecticut, March, very old, probably, igneous, volcanic, and placed it beside the limestone with ceremony. The house in Connecticut was used more after that. Not always, not often, but enough. A long weekend in June when the city felt too much like itself. A week in late summer that Sophie would later describe to Devin as the best week ever. A category she revised regularly, but meant every time. Victoria kept her apartment in the city. She wasn't going anywhere. Neither was Nathan. His work was here. Sophie's school was here. The infrastructure of his life was rooted in a way that wasn't going to relocate for sentiment. These were the practical realities of two adult lives that had each been built independently over years and did not simply merge like water. There were logistics. There were conversations that were harder than the ones they'd already had. There were the normal difficulties of two people trying to build a shared thing without dismantling what they'd each come from. The kinds of difficulties that don't resolve in a single scene and don't announce when they're finished. But Nathan took the Callaway Street Bridge route every morning now. He'd stopped thinking of it as her route and started thinking of it as the better way, which it was, which she'd told him from the beginning. Sophie, approximately 4 months after the Connecticut weekend, told her second-grade class during a sharing exercise that she had 2 homes now, which was said with the casual matter-of-factness of a child for whom 2 homes was simply a fact about her life, like brown eyes or a rabbit named Gerald. Her teacher had noted it in a report with the phrase, "Sophie appears to have a stable and loving home environment," and Nathan had read that sentence and sat with it for a long time. Stable and loving. Two adjectives he'd stopped believing could coexist in his specific life for a while. Two adjectives that turned out to be possible after all, which was not a revelation so much as a quiet, durable truth, the kind that doesn't arrive with music, just arrives and stays. Diane claimed credit for everything, which was fair. She said it over dinner at her and Marcus's house, a dinner that now included Victoria as a matter of course, as naturally as it included everyone else, no orchestration required. And she raised her wine glass and said, "I would just like to formally note that I did this." And Marcus said, "You say that every dinner." And Diane said, "Because it's still true every dinner." And Victoria looked at Nathan across the table with the look that had its own specific meaning by now. And Nathan shook his head slightly, and Diane saw all of it and was insufferably pleased. "She's not wrong," Nathan said. "I know she's not wrong," Victoria said. "It's still a lot." "I accept the acknowledgement," Diane said graciously. "I didn't—" Victoria stopped. "I'm not acknowledging, she's acknowledging," Nathan told Diane. "I heard," Diane said. Victoria looked at both of them, and then at Marcus, who was staying entirely out of it with the practiced neutrality of a man who had been married to Diane for 12 years and understood his role in these moments. "You're useless," she told him. "Entirely," he agreed, and refilled her wine. There is a thing people say about love, a shorthand version, the bumper sticker edition, that goes, "Love is blind." The implication being that when you love someone, you stop seeing their flaws, their limitations, the parts of them that are hard or imperfect or difficult to hold. Nathan Cole never believed that, not even when he was in it, because what he had learned in the specific and unromantic process of knowing Victoria Sterling, the real her, not the polished CEO version, not the composed public face version, but the woman who called her therapist on Saturday mornings and ate cold takeout alone at her desk, and had spent years doing the exhausting work of carrying herself through rooms that had already decided about her before she arrived. What he had learned was that love, real love, is the opposite of blind. It sees everything, the walls and the weapons and the particular kind of tired that lives underneath the competence. It sees the way she goes quiet when she's not quite okay and is too proud to say so, and the way she says okay when something real has landed, and the way she looks at Sophie, with that open, unguarded face, like she's been handed something she didn't know she was allowed to want. It sees the mountain of her, the full scale, and then it stays anyway, not despite what it sees, because of it. Victoria learned something too, in the specific and equally unromantic process of letting herself be known. She learned that the accounting, the ledger she'd been keeping since she was 23, measuring herself against the room's judgment, calculating the cost of every admission, tallying what she owed and what she was owed and what she'd lost and what she'd spent. That accounting was a habit, not a truth. A thing she'd built to protect herself that had eventually become the thing keeping her from the very things she'd been protecting herself for. She didn't stop being careful. She wasn't built to stop being careful, and frankly, the careful was useful. It was part of what made her good at what she did. The precision of her attention, the patience of her observation. She just stopped applying it to Nathan, stopped running the calculation on him, stopped waiting for the thing underneath. Because she'd done what he'd asked back in December, standing on a museum sidewalk, watching his daughter put a piece of gravel in her notebook. She'd considered the possibility that there wasn't a thing underneath, and she'd decided it was true. And it was. That's it. That April night, driving home from the gala, Victoria's driver taking the bridge route, as always, the city below and the sky above, and Nathan's hand still in hers in the back seat, she looked out at the water passing beneath them, and thought about a woman she used to be, not very long ago, who would spend the drive home doing the accounting. Whether she'd been too much. Whether she'd taken up too much space. She wasn't doing that tonight. She was thinking about the photograph Renata Park would run in 2 weeks, though she didn't know that yet. She was thinking about Sophie asleep at Marcus and Diane's house with Bucket the dog. She was thinking about a windowsill with 2 rocks on it. She was thinking about a man sitting beside her who had walked 3 steps backward at a party to say something true on her behalf. and who would probably do it again. Not because she needed him to, but because that was the kind of man he was. The kind who found cruelty obvious and called it what it was without ceremony or calculation. She turned from the window and looked at him. He was looking at her. He'd been looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The bridge passed beneath them, steady and solid. The kind of structure built to hold weight, engineered to last, designed by someone who understood that the most important thing about a bridge was not how it looked, but whether it held. It held. The car moved on through the night, and the city opened up around them. And everything that was going to be difficult was still going to be difficult. And everything that was going to be worth it was already, quietly, completely worth it.